Hi everybody and welcome to our second video on human reproduction. In today's video we are going to be looking at the hormonal control of the female reproductive system, and we will also be touching on aspects related to pregnancy. If you have not yet watched the first video, I will attach a link below so that you can check it out. Let us jump straight into the topic. We will start off by looking at the hormonal control of the female reproductive system. And this occurs within typically a 28-day cycle. And there are two cycles that take place. We have the ovarian cycle, which refers to the cycle taking place in your ovary, and we have the uterine cycle. And the uterine cycle refers to the stages and phases taking place in your uterus. We remember from our first video that the hormones that are produced in your ovaries have an effect in your uterus. And I have blocked out the uterine cycle for now. I will bring it in as we discuss the process later. So just like with your male hormonal control, we start off looking at the hypothalamus, and your hypothalamus secretes gonadotropin releasing hormone. And gonadotropin releasing hormone consists of two hormones. It consists firstly of follicle stimulating hormone, and secondly it consists of luteinizing hormone. And follicle stimulating hormone plays a role in your ovarian cycle. Once follicle stimulating hormone enters into the ovary, it stimulates the development of a follicle. And so a primary follicle, under the influence of FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, will mature into a Graafian follicle. And I will put the letter G here to represent a Graafian follicle. However, as your primary follicle develops into your Graafian follicle, estrogen is released from these follicles, and that is why your level of estrogen, or in terms of humans we call estrogen estradiol, increases. And then ovulation takes place, and ovulation normally occurs midway in your menstrual cycle. So if your menstrual cycle is a typical 28-day cycle, ovulation will take place around day 14. And ovulation is the release of your secondary oocyte into your fallopian tube. And your hormone, luteinizing hormone, increases quite drastically during the process of ovulation to assist in the process of ovulation. Once ovulation has taken place and the secondary oocyte has been released, we are left with a structure in the ovary called the corpus luteum. And your corpus luteum is responsible for the production of progesterone. And that is why after ovulation, we can see that the level of progesterone also starts to increase. Now, as I mentioned, the ovarian hormones have an effect on your uterus. So let's have a look and see what's happening to the uterus during this process. If we focus on this section, going onwards, we can see that as your follicle is developing and estrogen is increasing, so your endometrial lining also starts to increase. So this entire structure is your endometrial lining, and the graphic shows the thickness of the lining. So as estrogen starts to increase, your endometrial lining starts to increase. And then progesterone is secreted. And under the effects of progesterone, your endometrial lining continues to increase. So estrogen increases the thickness, whereas progesterone maintains that thickness. And the reason why that thickness has to be there is to ensure that if fertilization takes place and a zygote develops into an embryo, which will then be embedded or implanted into the uterus, there needs to be sufficient blood vessels, thick and muscular, to attach that baby into the uterus and also provide that baby with the nutrients that it needs. However, if no fertilization takes place, this secondary oocyte will leave the female reproductive system through the vagina. And along with that, your endometrial lining will break up. And that is what we see in this stage. Because fertilization did not take place, your endometrial lining started to decrease, because after a while, the level of progesterone starts to decrease. And if pregnancy had taken place, the level of progesterone would have been maintained. And as the placenta develops, the placenta would have taken on the role of producing progesterone. And once menstruation takes place in this region, as we saw, your level of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone start to increase again, and so the cycle will continue. The ovarian cycle has 3 stages. It has the follicular phase, which is this phase. It has ovulation, and the last phase is called the corpus luteal phase. Your uterine cycle consists of 3 phases. It consists of menses, or menstruation, your proliferative phase, in which your endometrial lining starts to build up, and then your secretory phase. And that is the female reproductive system from a hormonal perspective. So if we have to overview it, we have your gonadotropin releasing hormones, follicle stimulating hormone, which stimulates your follicle up to a Graafian follicle. Luteinizing hormone then increases drastically in the process of ovulation, which then forms the corpus luteum. Your corpus luteum secretes progesterone, which maintains the lining of your endometrium. And if fertilization has taken place, then the level of progesterone will remain constant. If not, the secondary oocytes must leave the female body, and along with leaving the female body goes the endometrial lining, and that causes the blood flow during the menses phase of the uterine cycle. We also see negative feedback in the hormonal control of the female reproductive system. Remember that negative feedback is a mechanism in which the increase of one hormone causes the decrease of another hormone. And we can see that between follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and estrogen and progesterone. So as the level of estrogen and progesterone start to increase, we see that your levels of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone start to decrease and continue to decrease up to a very low level. And that ensures that if a baby is potentially conceived and develops, that another follicle will not be stimulated and ovulation will thus not take place again. Next, we are going to look at what happens once your zygote has been formed in the fallopian tube. So once the process of ovulation takes place, we can then possibly have fertilization taking place. And if fertilization takes place, it means that the egg cell comes into contact with the sperm cell and their nuclei, their haploid nuclei fuse, and that forms a diploid zygote. That diploid zygote undergoes cleavage, and cleavage is rapid cell division without any growth taking place. The cleavage then continues, and the resulting structure after gastrulation is called a blastocyst. And your blastocyst has attachments on it called the trophoblasts, and these trophoblasts embed themselves into the endometrium, which is the inner lining of your uterus. And from this point, we see that your blastocyst is now embedded into the uterus and embryonic development can continue, and we will then form a fetus, which will then result in a baby. So during its first 2 to 4 weeks, the embryo obtains its nutrients directly from the endometrium. However, the trophoblast helps to form the placenta. And we see that blood from the embryo travels to the placenta through arteries of the umbilical cord and returns via the umbilical vein. And next we are going to look at the structure of the placenta in more detail. So when we look at the structure of a placenta, we notice that it contains two sections. It contains the fetal section, which is the section from your trophoblast, and it also contains your maternal sections, and that is the section of your endometrium. Your maternal arteries bring in oxygenated and nutrient-rich blood towards the placenta, and your maternal veins transport deoxygenated blood and waste away from the placenta. There is never a mix between the mother's and the fetus's blood. However, they come into close contact and diffusion can take place. So if we focus first on the blood in your maternal arteries, we can see that it goes into a fluid-filled space, and these fluid-filled spaces are basically pools of blood, which are called sinuses. And from this region, it can diffuse, and by it, I mean the nutrients and the oxygen can now diffuse into the umbilical vein. So your vein normally transports deoxygenated blood. However, in this case, it transports oxygenated blood towards the baby. And likewise, if we have a look at your umbilical arteries, they are transporting blood away from the baby. And this blood is deoxygenated blood. Arteries generally carry oxygenated blood, but your umbilical vein transports deoxygenated blood. And this deoxygenated blood travels via the umbilical arteries, and it then will enter into your fetal arteriole, and from this region it will diffuse back into the maternal blood pools and then enter into your maternal veins and then be transported back to the mother's heart. The placenta is important because it provides nutrition to the embryo. It also allows for gaseous exchange to take place. It also allows for excretion to take place. And it also acts as an endocrine function in that it produces progesterone to maintain the lining of your uterus or to maintain the lining of your endometrium. And the placenta also plays a role in natural passive immunity, in which antibodies can be passed down from the mother to the baby via the placenta. During the third trimester, we see that the fetus grows and fills the space within the embryonic membranes, and hormones like oxytocin are also released, and these can bring about the process of labor. And this is the process by which childbirth occurs. And the process of natural childbirth includes 3 stages. And during the first stage, we see that your cervix starts to dilate. So we have your cervix as normal, and it then starts to dilate, as we can see. And during our second stage, the baby is released. That's called the expulsion of the baby. Then we have our third stage, and our third stage is when the afterbirth, which includes the placenta and the umbilical cord, are released from the uterus. If we had to compare the extraembryonic membranes of an amniotic egg, for example, a chick, to that found in an animal like a human, we do see some differences. We do have the chorion, which is the same in both. It is the outer extra embryonic membrane. We then have the amnion, which provides a constant temperature and prevents shock absorption due to the amniotic fluid it holds. However, there's a difference when it comes to your waste excretion. In your amniotic egg, we have an allantois, whereas in an organism like a human, which develops vivipary and not ovipary, we have an umbilical cord, which helps to transport waste away from the baby. Likewise, with your yolk sac, we see that in a ovipary organism, your yolk sac is providing nutrients to the baby, whereas in a vivipary organism, the umbilical cord also plays a role in providing nutrients to the baby. And we also have the placenta in a vivipary organism, and that is not present in a chick. So that brings our Unit 5 to an end. I hope you enjoyed watching the video, and I hope you also learned something. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you soon.